Guys, look, I figured out how to record myself giving the lecture at the same time having the PowerPoint. So that's pretty exciting. I apologize for my voice. I have a bit of an allergy attack at the moment, but I wanted to pop up and explain really quick something about American imperialism, why we're having this lecture, and then the dates. So American imperialism, as far as U.S. historians are concerned, is a specific time period when the U.S. Reached beyond its borders and was working to create other colonies and protectorates. Some historians argue that this period has not ended, but we've taken on more subtle ways of spreading the American empire. And some more conservative historians argue that imperialism never existed at all, that America's never had any colonies and we've never been an empire in the first place. I fall in the middle of that, and most historians and textbooks are gonna hit that, center line as well. So just in case you're a little bit confused, if you've had more conservative or liberal professors or instructions, that's why. There is some arguments about this. So you may be a little bit confused too if you're looking at those dates that I have up there. Maybe be like, wait, I thought that era or that covers 1890 to 1914. Isn't that too the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, and how can things be all the things all at once? The short answer is yes. A lot of these periods overlap. So American imperialism does exist within the Gilded Age, and it also exists within the Progressive Era. So if that seems a little bit confusing, hopefully that, clears some things up. If not, go ahead and Google some timelines. You could get really in detailed ones as well. So last but not least, your textbook will talk a lot about some immigration during this period. And we kind of talk about that as well too, but I think it glosses over a lot of the intricacies of American imperialism, especially the ideologies behind it. And I think that the ideologies behind it are very important to understand, largely because this sets up the justification for a lot of our foreign policy for the rest of the 20th century, even going into the 21st. So it's really important that you understand some of those key ideologies that your textbook just doesn't go into. So if you have any other questions about this stuff, please hit me up on the Wikipedia page that's underneath each lecture, and hopefully I can clarify some more of those finer points. And again, if we're talking about the ideologies and then the actions that took place to reinforce those ideologies, I was trying to figure out a way to visually represent that for you guys. I came up with these two spheres, where on the one hand we have the ideology, and on the other hand we have the action that it brought about. And just so we're clear, an ideology is a system of ideas and ideals, especially one that forms a basis of either economic or political theory or policy. So case in point, an ideology that you probably have learned in 1301 or you will learn soon are a city on a hill, which basically says that God has predestined America to be this perfect place, and that by being the best at everything, by setting ourselves up as this shining beacon, that we can show everyone else how to do it, like how to do diplomacy or how to do economy or capitalism, whatever the case may be. It's this idea that God made America perfect, and we need to strive to maintain that perfection. Manifest destiny is another 19th century idea that says that God predestined the U.S. to span from Pacific to Atlantic Ocean. And it was the justification for a lot of territorial acquisitions in the 19th century and the Indian Wars and the Mexican-American War, the annexation of Texas, a lot of those things. So manifest destiny is another one of those theories that explains why the U.S. feels that it is their place to go and take other land that isn't theirs. American exceptionalism, we talked about during the Gilded Age with Frederick Jackson Turner. Again, remember that's that idea that unlike Europe, because of our geography, my lights went out. That's good to know. See, these are the things that you guys miss when you don't take my class in person. Anyways, so American exceptionalism is the idea that due to American geography, economy, our Constitution, our ideas about freedom, religion, liberty, all that sort of hoo-ha, that we are different than Europe, and that we, as being different and unique than Europe, we are also better than Europe. Social Darwinism, social gospel, we'll talk about in this lecture, so just hold your horses on that one. And then racism, you guys know what racism is, right? It's when the race that's in power, white people, figure out ways to oppress people who are not white, right? So racism is both an ideology and a practice, right? You can have racist ideas and actual racist actions. So that one shouldn't be too much of a stretch for you guys to understand. Okay, so on the left are all of our ideologies. On the right are the actions that we take. So we can take military imperialism, which results in those wars that I have listed there. We can take social imperialism, which involves both domestic actions like settlement houses, reforms, and education as well, whether it be educating the immigrants that come to the U.S. or trying to educate people abroad as to our American way of thinking and our ideologies. So use this slide, as like a cheat sheet through the rest of the lecture and maybe as a review, just to sort of get all your ducks in a row. To understand American imperialism, we very quickly have to go over foreign policy. Because of course, one can't be an empire unless you are involving yourself in places outside of the country. So before the imperialistic age, American foreign policy was pretty much guided by the Monroe Doctrine, named after James Monroe, U.S. president, and set out in 1823, which basically argued that, okay, America, we got the Western Hemisphere, right? You over there in Europe, you stay over there. You don't come to our side. We won't go to yours, okay? We're keeping things separate. So it basically gave us separate spheres of influence, and it told Europe that they should not and could not colonize places in our hemisphere. So that included places like Cuba, right? That's in our hemisphere, any of the Caribbean islands, South America, and as we'll see, other parts of Asia and Southeast Asia as well. You guys may be being like, but wait a minute, Europe did have colonies in this area and they were sticking their nose into our hemisphere. I don't understand. Yeah, they were. What basically the Monroe Doctrine did is it said, hey, don't come over here and start stuff. Don't get us involved in any wars that you may need to wage in order to colonize people near us. But at the same time, U.S. is not the sort of world powerhouse that we are today. It was not possible for us to actually to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It just set out there that if we wanted to, we could have this option. So the Monroe Doctrine falls away with the American imperialism. After we do all the stuff that I'm going to talk about in a second, our diplomacy sort of boils down to two things. One, the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, which you guys may know as succinctly as Roosevelt saying, speak softly but carry a big stick. The corollary became sort of our U.S. policy of the U.S. is now going to be the world police, and we're going to actually intervene in sort of foreign affairs when we think it's necessary. So oftentimes the military would bring in or be brought in as sort of a last resort to ensure that other nations in the Western Hemisphere fulfilled their obligations to international creditors, for example, and did not violate the rights of the U.S. or invite other foreign aggression to the detriment of the entire body of the American nations. And as the corollary worked out in practice, the U.S. increasingly used our military force to restore internal stability to nations in the region. So your textbook talks a lot about Roosevelt being elected and about Roosevelt's intervention in Panama. That's an example of the Roosevelt corollary in practice, right? This idea that the U.S. sees itself as sort of this big brother, and we're going to be able to pick a side that we think is right. And usually that right side is something that's going to be advantageous to us, either financially, like with the Panama Canal, or to reinforce an ally relationship that we may have with, let's say, Great Britain or France. So the Roosevelt corollary is sort of our military arm of foreign policy after imperialism. And then dollar diplomacy is sort of the financial aspect of it. And dollar diplomacy was a view held by President Taft, but really his Secretary of State Knox, who in a previous life was a corporate lawyer who had founded the giant conglomerate of U.S. Steel. And the goal of dollar diplomacy was to create stability abroad that would best promote American commercial interests. Knox felt that the goal of foreign policy and diplomacy wasn't necessarily to bring about peace, but to bring about financial opportunities and to create a space for U.S. Economy and, in particular, private capitalists to further their businesses. Now, in spite of these successes, dollar diplomacy fails to counteract the economic instability and the tide of revolution in places like Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and China. So Roosevelt corollary, that's our military branch. Dollar diplomacy, that's going to be our financial branch. And these are going to be sort of our foreign policy mainstays until the U.S. gets involved in all those messy world wars that are happening over in Europe. Now, social Darwinism, that's another one of those ideologies that popped up in my early, my first line. And it's also something that your textbook talks a lot about. And you may have even heard of it if you are, active in current events or you read a lot. Social Darwinism is basically the application of Darwin's theories of evolution on people in society. So it says that people and groups are subject to the same laws of natural selection as Darwinism. So this idea of survival of the fittest. And that could have some positive effects, right? As it is used to sort of justify charity and towards groups that are not doing so well, like, oh, well, these poor Italian immigrants, the reasons why they're like that is they're just not as good as us, native-born Americans. So we have to benefit them, right? We have to give them alms and, set up systems of support for them so that they can survive. But social Darwinism is largely used as a negative, largely because it's used to justify the relationship and theories of racial difference. So if you think about evolution, it says that all of the animals that exist today, the reason why they exist is because they were the strongest, that they figured out ways to adapt and to succeed. Now apply that to people, right? Then you got to look at our current social power structures and who's the wealthiest. And you may say, if you're in the 19th century, you may say, well, gosh, white men are on top. That must mean that they're the best. And all those other people on the bottom, well, that just must mean that there's something like physically and fundamentally different with them, okay? So it makes sense that, I've done so well in life because just biologically, that is what has been predetermined, okay? And there's a lot of things wrong with that, right? It can create a lot of problems. One of the biggest problems is that it leads to this argument that we're all at the same place in life and we all have the same sort of opportunities, but we just need to pick ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? How many of you guys have ever heard of that phrase before? Probably your grandparents have told you that. Or I think a more common one now is that millennials and Generation X are just lazy, and if we just learned how to work harder, then maybe we'd all have jobs, right? Or maybe we'd be able to buy a house or all those other things, okay? But the problem with that argument is it's not that millennials are lazy and aren't working hard, it's that we all have massive amounts of student loan debt because you guys set up an economy that forces us to have a college degree in order to get a job, right? So social Darwinism leads to these ideas that people need to be able to do for themselves, and if they fail, then that's their fault and not society's fault, okay? Just for an example of how social Darwinism can sort of go really wrong very quickly, one of the theories that gets morphed out of social Darwinism is this theory of eugenics, eugenics, okay? And progressives, as we'll talk about in our next lecture, progressives argue that because certain groups are going to do better than other groups, namely white people versus all non-white people, that we should limit the amount of children that non-white people have. And you may think, well, gosh, how would you limit the amount of kids that someone who's non-white would have? There are multiple cases, hundreds of cases of doctors taking it upon themselves to sterilize other people that they thought shouldn't have children anymore, okay? That's a form of eugenics. Like literally, there are cases of OBGYNs taking out the uteruses of women that they just helped give birth to or tying their tubes because they thought that they shouldn't have any more kids without the patient's knowledge and without their consent. And the reason why is they thought, well, gosh, she's already got 5 kids. She can't afford any more. I'm just going to take them away from her, right? Think about the ramifications of that and how horrible it would be to find out that you had a very serious medical procedure given to you without your knowledge, okay? That's how social Darwinism can go really bad really quickly. Okay, so we'll be talking a lot about social Darwinism throughout the next couple of lectures, but it plays a pretty key role in imperialism and how we view and treat some of the people that we're going to conquer throughout this era. Okay, so nuts and bolts of imperialism. Imperialism is when the U.S. took on colonies, which is a formal arrangement, like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and protectorates, which is an informal arrangement like Cuba and Panama. So in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, we said, okay, you are now a colony of us. Here are all the documents that we're writing up. And in Cuba and Panama, we said, okay, you're not a colony of ours, but we have a closer relationship than just common allies. We're going to help you with some things. Okay. So let me see here. Protectorates and open door policies promoted business expansions overseas through American oversight of foreign policies and government. And in the case of threats to economic strategies and interests, it deployed things like U.S. Marines or other military advantages. But in all of these imperial forms, the U.S. empire building both reflected and shaped our complex social, cultural, and political histories with ramifications for both parties involved. Seriously? Okay. All right. So what were some of the reasons why we colonized? First and foremost, we have economic needs. The U.S. is going through a depression in the 1890s, and manufacturers lobbied Congress and lobbied the president to figure out ways that they could expand their markets overseas. A perfect example is when Hawaii has a revolt of pineapple growers that are underneath the control of Dole, you know, the big Dole, D-O-L-E brand. They argue that McKinley needs to step in and, you know, send in the military to push down the revolt and strikes, and he doesn't. And this pisses off a lot of manufacturers because they see the federal government as an organization that needs to protect their financial interests. All right. Another reason was that in addition to the economic needs, there is a concern, a legitimate concern, that the U.S. is going to be sort of boxed out because every other country, westernized country in the world during this time, is making colonies. And you can see that to your left right there on that map. Think the color that the U.S. is just this hot pink. Okay, so we got the Philippines. In comparison to like the light purple, which is Belgium, or England, which has India and Australia and parts of Egypt and all that sort of good stuff, right? We didn't want to be left out, okay? Everyone was going through an imperialistic phase, and if they have all of the land, then they're going to have all the money, they're going to have all the trade, and suddenly that sort of open market that we may be able to get things from India, that closes, right? Because now we have to deal with Britain and we got to pay their tariffs, and we can't have a military port there or keep our boats there without paying taxes. So there's a legitimate concern that we need to get into this party. Some of the other reasons for imperialism are more mental exercises. There was a legitimate concern that with the West closing, remember the frontier thesis, that we were losing out on our exceptionalism. And not just on our exceptionalism, but also this overwhelming fear that once, you know, our ability to have that sort of safety valve of the West closes, what is that going to do to our urban cities, right? What is that going to do to our race relations? Are we going to have violence in the country? Are we going to have a whole bunch of inner squabbles and race wars? And who knows what bedlam's going to happen? So if we open up imperialism and open up the ability for people to go out and conquer, then we will also take care of that West closing problem. All right, now, some of the other ones that you are probably not familiar with, but maybe you are, who knows, are superior race theory, paternalism, and masculinity. So superior race theory is this idea that one race is better than all the other races, okay? And we'll talk more about that with some of our political cartoons, which are on the next slides, but I just wanted to give you that definition really quick. So superior race theory is this belief that God put Americans and other white English-speaking countries in power in order to take over non-white, non-English, or non-French speaking countries. Okay, so that's superior race theory. It has less to do with racial hatred and more to do with the belief that this sort of racial hierarchy was just a statement of fact. And there was a lot of sort of pseudosciences that supported that theory. For example, biologists during this time were known to claim that the white brain was actually physically bigger than like the African American brain. That's not true at all. Okay, but that was a sort of biological fact during the late 19th century, early 20th century. Paternalism, that is an idea that the U.S. is sort of a father figure, and that as that father figure, the U.S. should take control over less developed nations as sort of an act of benevolence, like how one might take care of a child. If you guys took my 1301, you guys will know that paternalism was the same theory that was used to justify slavery, that it would be mean or cruel to end slavery because the slaves were so enfeebled of mind that they couldn't possibly take care of themselves. You know, you wouldn't kick a child out into the world, and that slaves and, in this particular case, foreign peoples were very childlike. Now, masculinity, you guys know what that is, but in this context, masculinity was underneath this fear of attack. There were, again, with that West closing, right, there were concerns that men were becoming too soft, that with the rise of professionalism and white-collar jobs that happens during the Gilded Age, that there's no other place for men to sort of have that time to develop their manhood. And so literally, there was this idea that, hey, if we go off and make a whole bunch of wars, the men can go and test their mettle in battle, and they'll be stronger, you know, men altogether. And if this seems like a ridiculousness, I just want to point out some of the things that were happening in U.S. culture that engendered this fear. First, the West closed. Second, there was that overwhelming move to urban centers, and so men were sort of losing their roughness that came from living in a rural area. You know, their hands were getting soft, literally. There was a move to white-collar jobs. The lower classes, they were losing their skilled and artisan jobs, and instead they were becoming sort of cogs on the assembly line. We were still feeling the effects of the Depression in the 1890s, so there was a lack of employment, and with that, an inability to provide for the family, which was also emasculating. Women at the same time were fighting for more rights, including suffrage and the ability to have legal rights, so that was considered emasculating. And all in all, there was this fear that with the rise of, you know, mass-made products and consumption, that people and men in particular were going soft. And so what's a good way to harden them up? Go to war. So here is a political cartoon from Puck, which was a popular 19th century and 20th century publication that shows the correlation between American imperialism and superior race theory. So as you can see, these two gentlemen, one of them is obviously Uncle Sam, the guy in the stripes with the American flag hat, and the other is supposed to be representative of England. It's their version of Uncle Sam, and he's known as John Bull. And if you look at the baskets that they're carrying on their backs, you can see some pretty, what, you know, in our 21st century mind, thinks awful stereotypical representations of people of color and of members of other foreign countries. In England's back, they've got someone wearing a turban, probably, you know, a Chinese individual and a Japanese individual, and maybe someone stereotypical from Africa. And you can see they've got, if you look really close, you can see the country that they're supposed to represent too. In America's back, we definitely have Native Americans, someone from Cuba, and someone from the Philippines. And the title of this cartoon is A White Man's Burden. And so here's this idea that being a white individual means that we have the responsibility to carry these, you know, lesser individuals up this rocky, you know, face of a mountain, over things like superstition and ignorance and vice, all the way up to the pinnacle, which is civilization. So when we think of superior race theory, this is what we're talking about, okay? Oftentimes, I think in our current political culture, people, anytime you say that there's this idea that white people are better or white privilege or whatever, people have sort of like a knee-jerk reaction to that. And, you know, I'm not going to discuss that, but it is important that we know that there is a place for that in our history, that there are shining examples of that this is legitimately the way that people thought. And here's one of those examples. Now, paternalism, or that idea that the U.S. is a father figure and that needs to take control over these less developed nations, so similar to how one might take care of a child. Here's another political cartoon from Puck. And again, we have a school room setting where we have Uncle Sam, who is trying to teach these lesser students, these lesser places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, all sitting in the first row, how to be civilized. And they all look pretty petulant. In the back, some of the better pupils are the recently brought in states of like Texas and California and New Mexico. At the door, we have someone that might be meant to be representative of someone from China. In the window, someone who couldn't even possibly qualify for education is an African American. And in the dunce's chair, who is reading the ABC book upside down, is a Native American. So again, some pretty inflammatory things for us today, but this is legitimately how people viewed these people of different races and societies. And of course, too, don't forget that in the background, all the good pupils are white and probably of a middle-class background, whereas the you know, disobedient, petulant children are all of darker skin. Now, when we talk about, again, superior race theory, or this idea that America needed to participate in imperialism because we didn't want to be left out, here are two different cartoons. So the one on the right is showing McKinley, who was the president at the time, who was voted into office so that he could help America become more imperialistic, sort of serving up Cuba or Puerto Rico or the Philippines like a menu, you know, to Uncle Sam. And these were all viewed to be sort of like ripe for the pickings. And on the left is a cartoon in 1914, I believe, that shows that, you know, before the United States invested on behalf of these oppressed people, as it reads on the top, they were all like this. They were all very backwards, and they were all underneath the weight of things like Spanish suppression or industrial slavery. And then after the United States, rescued them from their oppression, they're all happy. So this idea that in Europe, their reasons for imperialism were to make money, but America's reasons for imperialism were to liberate and free people. And that is still an idea that we think of today. Even if we go back as recently as the 2000s with the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, very quickly the rhetoric of the reasoning for that war went first from being, retaliation from 9/11 to within a matter of, 3 months from it being from retaliation to supposed weapons of mass destruction to supposed human rights violations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that all happened very quickly as a means of justification for those wars. Now, speaking of imperialism, of course, these countries didn't, become our colonies willingly, and we actually had to go to war to gain those territories. The biggest war for this was the Spanish-American War, which lasted from April 21st until December 10th and ended with the Treaty of Paris. It was fought between the Cubans and Americans together on one side versus the Spanish, and then later involved a war or skirmish, depending on who you're talking to, in the Philippines, but we'll get to that in a second. So how did this war begin? Well, first of all, Cuba was underneath Spain's protection, and they didn't, or not protection, oppression, I guess. And they no longer wanted to be a part of Spain, so they approached the United States and asked them for help. They said, hey, you guys, why don't we be buddies? And then if we successfully overthrow the Spanish, then we can be trade partners, and you guys can use this as a military post, and it'll benefit both of us. And the U.S. agreed. So in January of 1898, they sent one of our battleships, the USS Maine, to be docked in Havana Harbor. By February 15th, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded. Now, the cause for the explosion has never really been proven, but most historians think that the explosion was an accident. They had highly inflammatory materials on the boat, along with gunpowder that could, in the right conditions, spontaneously combust. And so that's what they think happened, that it was just sort of a byproduct of some unstable materials. But thanks to the advent of yellow journalism, which was journalism based on sensationalism and speculation, that, did a lot to get readers to come in to buy their papers based off of inflammatory headlines, the cause of the sinking of the Maine very quickly became blamed on Spain. And they actually came up with the tagline, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And so this wasn't the actual cause, but so many people believe this to be true that politicians decided that, hey, man, this is going to get me a lot of support from my constituents if I vote for this. And so by April 21st, enough people believed this, fake news, as it were, that we actually declared war on Spain. The war itself was pretty quick. Even the Secretary of State, John Hay, put it as a splendid little war. And because it was so short and relatively few lost lives in actual battle, more people died from death of infectious diseases from mosquitoes and other bugs and things like that. And it garnered all politicians involved a lot of support, a lot of political support. We then were able to get Cuba as a protectorate. We also were ceded the rights to Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. and it allowed us to purchase from Spain the Philippines for $20 million. The war cost the U.S. about $250 million and 3,000 lives, but about 90 of those died from infectious diseases. So relatively few troops were actually lost. And they actually had an overwhelming number of individuals who wanted to join in the war, who the United States didn't necessarily need. We'll talk about those guys in a second. So the war ends in December. We get Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. But the problem is the Philippines, they are also trying to foment a revolution against Spain. So when the war ends, the Philippines are like, oh my gosh, this is so great. We now have independence too. And just like Cuba. And the United States is like, no. You don't have independence. You're ours now. We bought you. And Spain's like, but that's not what you did to Cuba. Or the Philippines are like, that's not what you did to Cuba. And the Americans just sort of like shrug their shoulders. We own you now. Let's move on. So that starts the Filipino-American War, which was a continuation of their independence struggle that they already had against Spain, and they really just changed bad guys. So that starts in February of 1899, excuse me, that date is wrong, and goes until about 1902 or 1906, depending on who you're talking to again. About 200 to 250,000 individuals died. The U.S. eventually won. They dismantled the Catholic Church as a state religion. We forced English onto the speakers, and we granted independence to the Philippines in 1946, ending the two-government system. Prior to that, and even I believe briefly afterwards, it was very easy for Filipinos to migrate to the U.S. or gain independence due to their sort of colonial status. The war in the Philippines involved a lot of guerrilla warfare, and it's quite an interesting war considering that a lot of the war was racially motivated, and again, it's one of those things that when you look at some of those political cartoons that we just talked about, if you notice a lot of the people who are supposed to be representative of the Philippines, they, at first look would look African American and not Filipino or Pacific Islander, which is their actual like ethnic heritage. And there's a lot of race relations involved in that. And if you are interested in that aspect, or the Filipino or the Spanish American War, let me know and I can give you guys some additional reading or recommendations if you want to learn more. Okay, so back to the Spanish American War. Like I said, there were a lot of people who were afraid that masculinity in the United States was under extreme threat. And so when we had all these wars of imperialism, here was our opportunity to sort of like test your mettle. And so one of the most famous of all of the fighting units in Cuba were the Rough Riders, which was the name given to the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry underneath the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt resigned his position at the time as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy so he could start this volunteer cavalry. And the original plan for this unit called it for filling it in with men from the Indian Territory, namely Oklahoma today. But once Roosevelt joined the group, it quickly became a place for a mix of troops ranging from Ivy League athletes to Glee Club singers to Texas Rangers and even some Native Americans. Roosevelt and the commander of the unit trained and supplied the men so well at their camp in San Antonio that the Rough Riders were one of the few groups to actually be allowed to see action in the war. And their famous battle was the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1st, 1898. And this battle actually became the stuff of legend thanks to Roosevelt's writing about it and his reenactments, which were filmed and then screened long after. And Roosevelt talks a lot about the Rough Riders throughout his political career and throughout the rest of his life. So again, it's just one of the very, numerous examples of how this war helped sort of like quote unquote save masculinity or American masculinity during this era. Okay. So whenever a country becomes an imperial power, it always means that they have to deal with people of different ethnicities and cultures. And it sort of proves how that empire is going to be when you look at how they will treat those different cultures. For example, the Roman Empire was known for being very inclusive and allowing cultures to maintain as long as, they did what they said politically or militarily. Same for a lot of the big Muslim empires in the, prior to the Crusades, right? They allowed the cultures to flourish or even religious freedom as long as they paid taxes to that effect. Western cultures were a little bit more, subtle on that sort of thing. And one of the things that the United States does to deal with this influx of immigrants and these new sort of intercultural interactions and racial interactions is we establish laws to prohibit people of different colors and ethnic backgrounds from entering the country. One of the most important of those is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this was pretty significant because it had a restriction on all immigrants of Chinese laborers. And the problem is that prior to 1882, Chinese individuals, namely young men who were bachelors, were allowed to come into the United States because they would take these labor roles like working on the Transcontinental Railroad or in the gold rush in California, and they would do the jobs that no one else wanted to do. But that didn't mean that the white individuals that were occupying the California or the railroads were completely cool with Chinese people. They viewed them to be sort of menacing and threatening, and even the U.S. government at the time termed Chinese immigration as the yellow problem. That was the phrase that was used frequently. And then they oftentimes referred to Chinese laborers as the yellow proletariat. And for those of you guys who aren't familiar, proletariat is sort of a fancy word for peasant or a servant class. So the racism towards the Chinese was pretty harsh. And so by 1882, this was viewed as too big of a problem that they forbid all Chinese from even coming in. And then they passed the Scott Act in 1888, which said that if any current Chinese residents in the U.S. went back home, that they could not come back in. So very frequently, they would go back home to bring over wives or get married in the first place, but they couldn't come back in. And one of the reasons for this law were protests against the Chinese and the Japanese that happened in the 1880s. There were very violent protests at work sites as the Chinese were used as scabs for strikes. In particular was the Rock Springs strike in Wyoming, which killed 28 Chinese and wounded 15. It also started a series of riots against the Chinese in Coal Creek, in arson in Seattle's Chinatown, and then mob action that expelled 300 Chinese from Tacoma, Washington, and surrounding towns in that November. And the riots were so bad that the federal government had to use the military to suppress them. And so that was the reasoning for the Scott Act, okay? At the end, President Cleveland was like, the hatred of the Chinese is so great that the riots are just going to keep coming, and that it's the best for all parties involved if these people just didn't come back anymore. And so if that seems, I don't know, not sort of like crazy and oh my gosh, like what the heck is that? Think about it in terms of any of today's immigrant groups. If violence against the Mexican people were so great that both the US government and the Mexican government said, you know what, it's just a good idea for you guys not to go there. Okay, think about how violent we would have to get to that point, right? Now, the Japanese 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement was similar to the Exclusion Act of 1882, but it was slightly more lenient. Basically, it said, you know, we won't stop the Japanese from going, but we're not going to allow them to get visas to do so, and we're not going to protect them, and we're not going to allow them to return back to Japan. So that was, again, another agreement between both the US and Japan. And it was more informal as well. And the goal was really to reduce the tensions between both parties involved, but it was never ratified by Congress and was ended in 1924 when another Immigration Act came onto the books. BT dubs, the Chinese Exclusion Act, ended sort of officially, I think, in 1934, but different states had laws on the books all the way up until the 50s and 60s that forbade Chinese immigration, okay? So the Chinese, it may not seem like it today, but there was a huge amount of racism against that particular group. Okay, so another way that imperialism can take form is through imperialism of the mind. So let's not forget that during this period of time, we have high numbers of immigration, right? So we have all these people that are coming into the United States, but we have to figure out some way to do that big egg word, assimilate them, okay? And so in the 20th century, excuse me, the education system was really fortified, and one of its primary goals was to sort of do this imperialism of the mind, otherwise known as assimilation. And assimilation is another really sort of tricky, controversial word today, but in the 20th century, it seemed like it would be a very good idea to assimilate all these cultures into American culture. And so early education, that's really something that you would have learned in 1301, but you know, it's on the slide just as an FYI. What we're more focused on is the third thing there, educating immigrants. And so one of the big problems that especially urban areas had was how do we educate all of these new groups that are coming into our cities that don't speak English and are Catholic, namely the Irish, Polish, some Lithuanians, some Russians, and Italians. What do we do with these people, right, that aren't our Protestant version of Christianity? Because in particular, during this time, it wasn't just that you had prayer in schools, you also had religion classes and actively trying to teach the children about the Protestant faith. And for the Catholic parents, they didn't want that. They didn't want their kids to be evangelized or to switch denominations or faith. So they sent their kids to parochial schools, which are predominantly Catholic during the time, but sometimes different schools that focused in on the teachings of a particular faith. And for both the Irish and the Italian, this is going to be overwhelmingly Catholic. The problem was, how do we justify paying taxes for these public schools when these kids then have to pay fees to get into these private parochial schools? Okay, it's still something that we're debating on today. But one of the things that actually took place, as you'll see, parochial schools, that whole debate lasted from 1869 all the way up to 1922. One of the end results is that public schools in 1922 would no longer have religious classes that were denomination based. Okay, you could have prayer in schools, and most of them did, but it would no longer have that denomination attached to it. The other concern was, what languages do we allow to be spoken in public schools? A similar debate that we have today, but there was a strong belief among many nativists that in order to assimilate, that these kids should only be allowed to speak English and should only be taught English. But as is a problem with a lot of immigrant groups, many kids didn't know the language and their parents didn't know the language. So how do we debate that back and forth? Case in point, I grew up in a really, really small town that is overwhelmingly German, and my grandmother remembers German being spoken in school very frequently because that's what a lot of the kids, that was their first language, and English was their second language. So that too is another issue that was, sort of at the forefront of how do we make these immigrants, not Irish, not Italians, not Polish, how do we make them into Americans, right? We teach them our version of Christianity and we teach them our language. Going along with that, during this time, there's also a rise in vocational training and colleges. For vocational training, I have, Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee University. And that was really vocational training was really a school of thought for people of color and African Americans in particular, that the best way for them to succeed in life would be through learning a skill that could then lead to entrepreneurship, and that could lead to sort of equality or the best life that an African American could lead, and that it was a waste of time to fight for civil rights, which would be something that W.E.B. Du Bois would be more an advocate for. Additionally, colleges and the desire to have a college education rises during this time as well. And this is for both male and female. And by 1875, there are 3/4 more colleges than there have been 15 years ago. And by 1890, most of the colleges that you would think of today have been established. So if you think of the big land grant universities, again, I'm from the Midwest, so this is what I think of, but University of Wisconsin, University of Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, all of those have been established by then. University of Texas, let me look it up really quick. Hold on. So yeah, University of Texas was founded during this time as well in 1881. So colleges, they become a really important part of something that's going to happen in our next lecture, which is the rise of professionalism. So keep that on the back burner. And last but not least, we need to talk about populism. And populism sort of like the odd man out in a lecture about imperialism, because overwhelmingly populists were isolationists. But we really need to understand populism if we're going to understand progressives and going forward in our political story. So we need to talk about it. So populism is a political party. Its heydays were from 1891 to 1908. And like the political cartoon on the left shows, it included a lot of different political parties that sort of rose and fell. You'll see here it's got the People's Party, the Farmers Alliance, the Greenback Party, Communists, Free Silver, Prohibitions, the Knights of Labors, you know, and then the little basket says the Platform of Lunacy. But it included farmers, people who lived in non-urban areas, some Democrats, people from a lot of different socioeconomic classes. They were anti-corporate, but not anti-capitalist. They were against those robber barons that had created monopolies that really pushed out a lot of the middle class and lower middle classes people out of the economy, because whereas they would have been a small business owner prior to the rise of, you know, the robber barons and the Gilded Age, now they're struggling to have their businesses function and take care of their families. They were also Free Silver Party, which can be a little bit confusing, especially as it reads in your textbook, so I'm just going to explain that real quick. So there were two groups in terms of currency. There were the gold bugs that believed that a sound national economy needs to be based on the gold standard to ensure the dollar's stability, and that it guaranteed unrestricted competition in the marketplace and promoted economic liberty. And the Silverites believed that the currency should also be redeemable in silver as well as gold. And one of the reasons why is because if you introduced silver as part of the currency, that metal could be mined in abundance in the West. They had discovered huge mining loads in Nevada in particular, parts of California, and other areas in the Rocky Mountains. And this would produce an increase in a more flexible money supply that they hoped would then lead to a more equal economy and foster more social reforms. So if that's still confusing, don't forget that during this time, money is real. Okay, today money is imaginary. You know, it's very possible that you don't use cash or coins at all on a daily basis, right? You get paid direct deposit into your bank account, the numbers change on the screen, and then it says that you can now spend, you know, $100 or whatever the case may be, and then you swipe a card or you write a check, and then that $100 is spent. During this time, that $100 meant that there was an equal value of gold, of $100 worth of gold sitting in a bank somewhere. And at any point in the transaction of cash, that holder of a $100 bill could go to a bank or go to a Federal Reserve and say, I want $100 worth of gold. And they would give them $100 worth of gold. Okay, that money was real. Now the money is sort of based off of good faith, right? We don't have a gold back or a silver back. But gold was rare, and it still is. And so if one particular group, like the robber barons, had most of the gold, that means it's going to rise inflation, because now that dollar is more valuable. Because if a smaller group of people has all of the money, they can't spend that money as much as, 100 people could spend that money, right? So if we introduce silver, that's going to lower the value of gold and it's going to equal out the playing field. And so for the populace, being free silver meant that it gave more people sort of a fair shake. And so this idea of free silver is really important to the platform of the populace. Now, the populace also pitted or also sort of were their own worst enemy. And one of the reasons why was because, well, they could get people elected in the lower, like local elections, House of Representatives, Senate, that sort of stuff. They could never get someone elected to the president. And the best option for that, the best candidate during this time was William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan was a populist, and he went into the 1896 Democratic National Convention. And this is a little bit different during this time. It wasn't like today where you have a whole bunch of primaries prior to the convention, and then the convention, they, elect who that representative is going to be based off of those primaries. In this particular case, anyone that was present at the convention could potentially get the nomination. And so Bryan gives this great speech known as the Cross of Gold speech, which pitted the populists and the Democrats and the lower classes against the Republicans, but really the wealthy and the elite on the Atlantic coast, and says we're not going to be, hold America up and crucify it on a cross of gold just to keep the old standard. We need to do things like free silver and have more reforms in order to make things better. Bryan's eventually loses. He was also, because he was a populist, he was an isolationist, bringing more immigrants into the country or spreading out all of the U.S. resources to deal with all these empires was not something that the populists supported. And later, during World War I, he becomes Secretary of State. That's going to have some ramifications to have an isolationist there. And he's also famous because he was the opposition in the Scopes trial. He said that the theory of evolution should not be taught in schools. He lost as well. So Bryan's is an interesting character, and populism is going to pop back up as well, because one of the things that it does is it steals people from the Democratic Party, and it makes the Democratic Party not as powerful. And so for the next couple of presidential cycles, you're going to see Republican presidents and not necessarily strong Republican contenders winning that office.